Howdy, and welcome to the Digestive System I. This podcast has to do with the reflexes in the GI tract, or the gastrointestinal tract, so parts of the tube, reflexes within the digestive tube. So if we look at the different, let's look at the tube first. So if you look at the bottom of the cartoon, you see it says the lumen of the alimentary canal. So the alimentary canal is also called the GI tract, aka the gastrointestinal tract. So in this cartoon, it's called the alimentary canal. So the alimentary canal or the GI tract has a wall, and it shows to the left, it says the gastrointestinal wall. And so if you listen to the earlier podcasts on what comprises the wall of the tube, then you'll know there are plexuses within the wall of the tube that control the smooth muscle cells that make up the wall of the tube, so that you can move things along the tube. Like, for instance, when you eat food, you mechanically begin chemical digestion of that food. That food then becomes a bolus, and it needs to be propulsed along the esophagus. And the way you do that is with these digestive system reflexes and in the process of peristalsis. So, in other words, within the gastrointestinal wall, that's where the nerves live, the nerves or the neurons of the enteric nervous system, and also where the parasympathetic nervous system starts. The sensory afferent neurons will, in the parasympathetic nervous system, will sense stretch of the tube, and it will send that information via visceral afferent neurons to the central nervous system, and that's what it shows on the blue line. So if you look at the cartoon, you can see where it says the internal GI tract stimuli, and then it's got a blue line to a box that says chemoreceptors, osmoreceptors, or mechanoreceptors. So if there's material inside the tube, it'll have a certain chemistry, and the cells that line the lumen of the tube will sense that chemistry. Also, cells can sense the osmolarity of whatever is in the tube, and then the tube can stretch and relax, so there are mechanoreceptors that sense that stretch. And they're sensory afferent neurons, but they're a particular type of sensory afferent neuron that lives in the viscera or the gut. But they'll take that information about the chemistry, the osmolarity, and the stretch of the tube. They'll take that information neurally along the visceral afferents to the central nervous system. If you take that information, so the blue line that's pointing vertically towards the central nervous system, that would represent visceral afferents of the autonomic nervous system. But then if you look at chemoreceptors, osmoreceptors, or mechanoreceptors, that box, there's also another blue line that goes to the local or intrinsic nerve plexus. That's the enteric nervous system. So whenever there is a change in the chemistry or osmolarity or the stretch of the alimentary canal, you use both your short reflexes, your short neuronal reflexes via the enteric nervous system, and your long neuronal reflexes via the autonomic nervous system. But then you can see the red lines. What that shows you is that the central nervous system can send out visceral motor efferents, neurons that will release a neurotransmitter on effector cells like smooth muscle cells or cells of glands, and then those smooth muscle cells or glandular cells, once they've been told by the autonomic nervous system or the enteric nervous system to perform a response, then those cells will they will perform that response. So smooth muscle cells will change their contractile status, and then the glands can change their secretory activity. So with that in mind, let's look at peristalsis. So peristalsis is controlled by both short and long reflexes, and it's peristalsis is alternate waves of longitudinal and circular smooth muscle cell contraction and relaxation that will help move the food stuff, the food or the bolus or the chyme, wherever you are in the tube, help move that matter through the whole GI tract. So peristalsis occurs along the whole GI tract. So the bolus, in this case, in this cartoon, it's a cartoon in the upper right-hand corner, that's the esophagus, and so that's a bolus. That brown thing is the bolus. The bolus will stretch the esophagus, and then the chemistry of the bolus, so the chemicals that are in the bolus will be sensed by cells that live along the tube. And then that information will go to the enteric nervous system, and you'll have a short reflex loop that will cause constriction and relaxation of circular and longitudinal smooth muscle cells. And then that information, like we saw on the previous slide, that information on the stretch of the tube, the chemistry of the tube, the osmolarity of the tube, that information will be sent neuronally to the central nervous system. That's the long vagal reflex, and they call it that because they use the vagus nerve to send the sensory afferent neuron information about the stretch of the tube, for instance, and then also the vagus sends out the motor efferent information to tell the smooth muscle cells to relax or contract, and tell the glands to secrete or to not secrete. So swallowing, I've told you in previous podcasts, clinically is called deglutition, and it's controlled by, there's a swallowing center in the medulla and the pons, and you have input, sensory afferent input via the cranial nerves 5, 7, 9, and 12. This is a cartoon of the deglutition process. So if you look on the left-hand side, you can see the bolus of food in the oral cavity. The epiglottis is up. And then there's an esophageal sphincter that's contracted. So, and the, show on that, yeah, the epiglottis is up. So this is just when the bolus of food is in the oral cavity. So when the process of deglutition or swallowing begins, the bolus moves towards the esophagus. So the control of the esophagus has to, the control of the epiglottis tells it to lay down over the glottis so that the bolus doesn't go into the trachea. And then you also have to relax your esophageal sphincter so that the bolus can move into the esophagus. And then on the right-hand side of the cartoon, when the bolus is moved into the esophagus, then the glottis the epiglottis goes back up, and the esophageal sphincter contracts. And then you can see that the bolus moves along the esophagus by relaxing and contracting both the longitudinal and circular smooth muscle cells of the muscularis externa. I think that's it.